English is easy in the beginning, but hard later on. This is a maxim I've heard from countless Spanish and Italian speakers when describing their experience learning English. And many of them speak excellent English, by the way. It's almost become a general truth. And I think there's actually something to it. Now, of course, I can't claim to understand exactly what every single individual means when they repeat this oft-repeated statement about the English language. But I think we can make some linguistic inferences from it, especially if we try and compare English to Romance languages. You see, I think English is easy compared to the Romance languages in this sense. English has very restricted inflectional variety in its verb conjugations. For example, the verb to eat in English is conjugated as I eat, you eat, he or she eats, we eat, you all eat, and they eat. And except for the change in the third person, the actual verb itself doesn't change at all. It's eat, 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 eat. The pronoun is what makes the difference in meaning here. And amongst the Romance languages, that isn't the case. French is the Romance language that comes the closest. For example, je mange, tu manges, il ou elle mange. And in the plural third person, il mange. But that's really more of a phonetic seeming lack of inflection. If you see it in writing, there's still a lot of inflectional variety in French. There's also another reason I think English might be considered easy at the beginning, and that would be its syntax. English follows a simple subject, verb, object order. We've got very few of those weird distinctions that crop up in Spanish, for example, those dative experiencer constructions in me gusta, me encanta, me interesa, etc., etc. Not really something we see a lot in English. We can, of course, mess around with our sentence structure for poetic or rhetorical reasons, but those are exceptions that prove the rule. And I think as these features, basic conjugation and syntax, are what students of English are first taught and what speakers of English first need to acquaint themselves if they find themselves in an English-speaking country, it generates this idea that English is an easy language at first. And so that, I think, explains the first part of that maxim. English is easy at the beginning. But what about the second part? English is hard later on. I think once you've become acquainted with the English language, things get very difficult. And it's on the level of pronunciation that I'm talking here. English phonetics, I think, are exceptionally difficult. So difficult that I often thank my lucky stars that English is my first language, because there are a lot of sounds, subtle shades of difference in phonetic realizations that I don't think I would have been able to replicate were I not an English speaker natively. And to make my case, in today's video, I want to compare how the grapheme T is realized in English vis-a-vis the Romance languages, especially Spanish. I want you to look at the following clip.
Gonzalo, welcome to the club. Now, we'll start off by saying you're very kindly going to do this interview in English with us, yes?
Yes, I'll try. I'll do my best. I'm sorry because my accent's not pretty good. I need to practice a bit, but I'll try my best.
That's Gonzalo García. He's just signed for Fulham Football Club, and he should in fact make his Premier League debut next week. It's immediately evident in that interview that Gonzalo's English is frankly superb. You can still hear traces of his native Spanish accent, that's natural, but what truly stands out is his near mastery of some of the most difficult phonetic aspects or contexts of the English language. There's a lot that Gonzalo gets right in this video, but there are a few points that I'd like to hone in on, and as I said in the introduction, that's going to be how he realizes this grapheme T. You'll notice at the very beginning of the interview how Gonzalo says not and but.
My accent's not pretty good, but I'll try my best.
In that but, the vowel approximates what we would call a weak form. Now, a weak form is something that exists generally in languages, but it crops up a lot in English. That's the change in a vowel that occurs when we don't stress it as opposed to when we do stress it. For example, think about the word them. When I stress that word, the vowel is very different as opposed to when I don't stress that word. Compare these two following sentences. I've already spoken to them. I've already spoken to them. In the first one, I say them, and in the second, I say them. It's the difference between a and e. These weak forms that tend to crop up in English when we don't stress the vowels in particular words is one of the more challenging parts of the English language. It's not something we see nearly as much in the Romance languages. But what I find really interesting is that Gonzalo García has managed to somewhat approximate that, even though it isn't something that really is a native feature of his mother tongue, Spanish. Certainly not as far as I understand. So that's just a side comment on how he realizes the vowel in but. He doesn't necessarily say but more but. What that weak form leads to, however, is what we're principally interested in this video, and that's how he realizes the T at the end of but. He realizes it as something that we would call an unreleased T. And this occurs when T finds itself in the coda of a word after a vowel or a sonorant. It's often represented phonetically like this, and sometimes it's even pronounced as a glottal stop. That is that sound that we often make in English. More on that in a moment because it will become important. So what you'll notice there is that Gonzalo realizes that final T as something between an unreleased T and a glottal stop. He says, but I'll try my best, not but I'll try my best. If we look slightly early on at how Gonzalo says not in English, we also realize that even though not doesn't have a weak form, that is to say the vowel doesn't become like a schwa, it doesn't become weaker or lazier, he nonetheless actually pronounces that T as an unreleased T, almost something approximating that glottal stop. He says not.
My accent's not pretty good.
Now, I think to ground ourselves a bit better here, it's worth comparing the articulation of the grapheme T in English and the Romance languages. The English T has a much richer set of context-dependent realizations than the Spanish T. And several of the realizations that Gonzalo García uses in this interview are not part of the Spanish phonetic inventory. This is what I find very impressive. I think also it's important, however, to note that this is not a value judgment. I'm not saying that because English has a greater variety of T realizations that English is in some sense superior to Spanish and the other Romance languages. Not at all. The first difference between English and the Romance languages, especially between English and Spanish, is that in English, the T is typically a voiceless, aspirated alveolar plosive. So the standard T, if I may use that term, is actually an alveolar realization, as opposed to the dental realization in the Romance languages. It's also aspirated in English. When we say the T in a word like time, the tongue touches the alveolar ridge, but then it's followed by a puff of aspiration. Time. Compare that with a standard Spanish T, which is by contrast a voiceless, unaspirated dental stop, the sound that we hear in tarde. So in English speakers, t in time, and the Spanish speakers, t in tarde, are two completely separate phonetic qualities, even though they're represented by that same grapheme, T. I think it's worth using a chart that I've created rapidly on Notion in order to understand the whole family of realizations that the letter T has in English. Now, what I'm using here is what I would call standard Southern British. I'll elaborate on that slightly more in a moment. But keep in mind that this is the kind of English that you will hear in most news broadcasts today from England itself. The first realization we have for T in English we might call a stressed syllable onset. That's what I mentioned earlier. It's that aspirated alveolar realization of T that we see in time, where there's this puff of air after the alveolar tap. It becomes unaspirated, an unaspirated alveolar sound, when we find it after S in an onset. So, for example, a word like stop doesn't have that aspiration that time and try do. When we find it in a coda after a vowel or a sonorant, as in the examples of not and but by Gonzalo in our interview video, it's got a variety of potential realizations. You can see there are about 3 to 4 up here on screen at the moment. We could pronounce these words, not and cat, as not cat, or not cat, and sometimes even as not cat. When we find it in a final consonant cluster of a word, it's somewhere between that unaspirated alveolar in stop and the aspirated alveolar in time. Let's use our example word as best. I could say it as best or best, with or without the aspiration. What's particularly relevant in this interview with Gonzalo is how we pronounce our T's when they're followed by another consonant in another word. It's often unreleased, as I mentioned earlier, or glottally reinforced, reduced in some form. Notice how I say T in not good. It's not really not good, and it's not a full glottal stop, not good, but it's something in between those two, not good. My tongue ever so slightly taps the edge of the alveolar ridge. Now, to summarize all of this, the realization of English T is famously variable. Even though this T is one phoneme, all of these that you see up on screen are potential phonetic manifestations of it. In contrast, the Spanish T that Gonzalo would have grown up speaking is much more stable. Look at the following examples. Todo tengo matar. Unlike English, Spanish doesn't have standard variation depending on syllable position, nor does it normally aspirate its T. So far, we've looked at how Gonzalo uses that unreleased, almost glottalized T in but and not. Let's look at some of the other realizations of T that we see from Gonzalo in this video. And one of the ones that I really like is the alveolar tap he realizes when he says the word pretty in English.
I'll do my best. I'm sorry because my accent's not pretty good.
He says pretty. And that, by the way, is actually how, in most contexts, certainly in formal contexts, English speakers of standard Southern British and my own accent would say pretty. This interests me particularly because what Gonzalo is doing here is he's actually replicating a sound in his own native Spanish. The way that he realizes that German T in pretty, like the alveolar tap r in his native Spanish. And what I think is interesting here is that he's learned to distinguish this realization from the many other possible realizations of T in English, even though he might conceptually have some kind of advantage, that is, familiarity with this alveolar tap in his native Spanish. He's had to associate it with a completely different set of symbols in English. I think most of you, as L2 English speakers, have already done something similar, and it's fascinating that you've been able to make that almost intuitive transition. Another interesting example is Gonzalo's realization of best, when he says, "I'll try my best." That's a lightly aspirated T in English. Overall, I want to congratulate Gonzalo García at his remarkable capacity at replicating the rather complex range of T sounds that English has. But having said what I have so far in this video, I think it's important to qualify what I'm saying carefully here. When I'm comparing Spanish and English, I'm of course comparing a particular kind of Spanish with a particular kind of English. Specifically for English, I'm talking about standard Southern British. And I use this as the metric for comparison for two reasons. Firstly, it's the kind of English that today we most commonly hear on news broadcasts, which is often the standard that sociolinguists use to determine what is the prestige dialect at any given time in any particular language. The second is that this also seems to be the kind of accent that Gonzalo García has learned. Now, I don't know too much about his educational background, but it certainly seems to me, as a native English speaker, that this is the kind of English he's trying to emulate and imitate. And notice that I say that standard Southern British is the standard accent of British English now and not RP or received pronunciation. Those are two very different things. And if you're interested in why RP is not considered the modern standard dialect of British English and how the accent has lost that kind of place, I recommend that you look at the work here on YouTube of Dr. Jeff Lindsay and also Simon Roper. Those two are truly the gold standard for English phonetics here on YouTube. And if I say anything that is contradicted by what they say, please go with them because they know far more than I could ever hope to know about English phonetics. So that's the standard I'm using for English, standard Southern British. For Spanish, I'm thinking about standard Peninsular Spanish. Although a lot of what I've said about the standard Spanish realization of the grapheme T as the voiceless dental affricate T actually applies across the globe to most Spanish accents. The standard that I'm using for Spanish here is sort of what we would consider the standard dialect of central and north central Spain today. Now, I have to do this because there are tons of English accents out there, and there's a lot of variation in Spanish as well. So I need to at least find two poles to reliably compare against each other. As a slightly humorous example of what could happen if I don't use one standard English accent, many of you might have seen this meme doing the rounds right now, which states that British English speakers would call this thing a bottle of water. Now, in reality, what the meme doesn't tell you, and many of those who take the meme at face value don't understand, is that that's actually just one possible way of pronouncing this. For most English speakers, for speakers of standard Southern British, and for speakers of English like me, we would call this a bottle of water simply. Most English speakers, and almost certainly Gonzalo García, would not have as dramatic a set of glottal stops as you see in bottle of water. That's that sound that you hear in that kind of pronunciation. Now, in looking at Gonzalo Garcia's impressive Spanish and comparing it with what I, as a native English speaker, would say, I've had to constrain the sample size of this video to English and Spanish. But a lot of what I've said actually applies to Italian and Portuguese and French. I've also been curious in researching this video how T is realized in Catalan. So I thought I'd round out this video by providing a table comparing cognates across these 5 Romance languages and English. I think the comparison is bound to be fun and instructive. What I will say beforehand is that I've got very limited exposure to Catalan, so I'm happy for you to correct my pronunciation there. But what I have noticed about the Catalan language is that it's unusually happy to end native words in a stop, including the dental T. Because this is often a stop, narrow phonetic transcriptions tend to render it as this with that symbol there at the bottom, although broad transcriptions keep to the rather bland symbol like this T sound. So let's look at this table that you can see now on screen. Let's compare how T is realized across these 6 languages in an initial before a vowel. In standard Peninsular Spanish, we have the word for the drink te. You can see that there it is a standard unvoiced dental affricate. If we look at Central Catalan, we have the word talia, where we see it realized pretty much the same as in standard Peninsular Spanish. Standard French word for the drink is te, Italian te, and Portuguese tua. In English, however, we would pronounce this initial before the vowel as T. There's much clearer aspiration in English. While there are some variations across the Romance languages, none of them seem to have the same aspiration that English does. Let's look at how T is realized across these 6 languages in intervocalic contexts. Let's look at the Spanish word pata. As we can see, it's realized essentially the same as in te earlier. In Catalan, we have mata, which has the same realization as T in an initial before a vowel, seen above in dia, but without the emphasis. In French, the word that I've chosen is the word for summer, été. And what I find kind of interesting here in French is that there seems to be an ever so slight distinction in articulation. That is to say, the tip of the tongue in été seems to be more alveolar as opposed to te for T. So, te and été. I hope that that comes across clearly in the slight distinctions in phonetic transcription that I've looked at here. In Italian, the intervocalic example I want to use is vita, where we see the same realization as in te. And in Portuguese, I'm using nata, almost exactly the same phonetic realization as earlier in tua, but the difference might be a slight change in articulation, with nata moving slightly more towards the alveolar ridge as opposed to the teeth. In English, this intervocalic T tends to be much more context dependent. You might hear it aspirated, for example, in butter, if I'm paying specific attention to how I say that word. You might also see it pronounced almost as an alveolar tap. If I'm speaking quickly and I say, I've got to think about what I have to do, the T is a d, gotta think. Let's look at the next potential realization, and this is when the T comes after S. In Spanish, we have estar, the same T as in the previous examples of te and pata, estar. Central Catalan has the interesting está, which is realized the same way as the above two examples, talla and mata. In French, we see pretty much the same realization as in ete when we see stad. And in Italian, there's almost identical realization in stare. Portuguese is interesting because arguably the palatalized consonant does change the way that t is pronounced in estar. And in English, often when T follows S, we pronounce it as an aspirated T, stop, stationary, student. Before an R, how do we pronounce our T's? Well, in Spanish, tres follows exactly the same pattern as te, pata, estar. In Central Catalan, we see similar, close to identity with the previous forms in tres. French gives us the more clearly dental realization in tre. Italian dre remains consonant with te and vita, and Portuguese trej follows the pattern established in its previous T realizations. What's interesting, however, is that when we find a T in English before an R, it's often affricated and palatalized. Try, triumph, triple. We pronounce it as a ch sound. What about the context that we see so often in that interview with Gonzalo García? That is to say, word final or surface final T. Now, in Spanish, it's important to understand that this hardly ever arises in native Spanish words, so I'll skip Spanish and move straight on to Catalan. That has a predilection for this kind of formation. The Catalan word for seven is set. However, that T doesn't seem to change its articulation simply because it's towards the end of the word. French set is a clearly dental realization. In Italian, we hardly ever come across word final natively, so we'll skip it as well. But in Portuguese, it does come across in a certain sense because of the tendency to elide word final E vowels. So the Portuguese pot can often surface as pot. In English, however, it's super common, and there's an enormous variety of ways that we can pronounce the simple word cat. We can pronounce it as I just have, relatively aspirated cat, but we could also say cat, or even use a glottal stop, cat. Have you seen my cat? Now, this video has been a long exploration of T sounds in the Romance languages and in English, but I'm curious. I want to use this video, if possible, as a kind of social experiment. You see, our demographics on our channel indicate that roughly half, perhaps more than half of you are not native English speakers. So I'm keen to know, do you find these forms in English particularly difficult? Do you find realization of T and the way that the realization of T varies according to context is actually a serious challenge for you to overcome? Or is it something that you've kind of taken in your stride once you've learned English? I'm very, very curious about this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. For now, I'll thank you very much for watching today's video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye and take care.